Dr. Eberhard, people who had a near-death experience oftentimes describe something like a world of the hereafter. Taking these descriptions, is it somehow possible to derive from them what the hereafter could look like? Do all these people describe the same thing?
There are groups or toppers, as we call them, that reoccur, but at the same time, there can be found an enormous individuality. What I mean is that there is a huge disparity, and there are also very bizarre elements. When we take a look at the transportation to the hereafter, for example, I find it particularly interesting that there are people who take a taxi or ride a cow. And there is also a person from Luzern. So from here, who got onto a cable car, something we know quite well in Switzerland. And he went up to heaven, and he arrived, and there was this button where he could choose whether he wanted to stay or not. And then he pressed the button to return. So that's quite bizarre. Or also, when we take a look at the buildings, the architecture in the hereafter. There are fantastic buildings. For example, two people who had a near-death experience described in a quite similar way that there was a giant library where all the knowledge was stored in, and that it was a sort of ivory tower that went up to the clouds, or that there were cities that were made out of glass or crystal. And there are also very trivial aspects such as these Polynesians who come from a factory where they finally get a job that they had longed for. So, there is a huge disparity.
What about the aspect of corporeality? Is there something like a uniform description of the soul body?
Well, here the descriptions are similarly inconsistent. So there are people who report after having a near-death experience that they actually didn't have a body, or that they didn't remember having a body, or it was something they couldn't describe in any way. This is something we have to briefly presume as well somehow. People who return after having a near-death experience claim or emphasize that what they experience can't really be described. This is something we always have to put in context. So what we're talking about now are aspects that may sound very trivial and aren't that communicable. So we've got to take this with a pinch of salt. There are people who claim that they didn't have a body at all, and that there are people who describe it as a sort of cloud or cloud-like, or even bluish. And then there are people who clearly talk about a soul body, and that they saw hands and feet. And interestingly, it's not so rare that people describe that they had no body, but somehow they had a body, and that within the same near-death experience, so they would say, well, I wanted to make myself known and I put my hand through this person that I wanted to grab, but I put my hand through this person instead. So there is something like a corporeality, and at the same time there is none. It's actually quite blurry.
So the descriptions are very diverse and individualistic. Compared to this, are there also some aspects that reoccur?
Yes, definitely. These are the toppers I mentioned before. When we take a look at the physical level, this can be demonstrated quite well because people repeatedly describe that when they leave their body, they take on a hovering position, which is horizontal at first. Then they straighten up, and then they float up and very rarely down. They also mention that they act telepathically, meaning that they sense what others think. This is something that reoccurs quite frequently, and that's something that isn't normal, something we don't know and wouldn't expect. Then at the same time, they don't feel any pain and their senses are stronger. For example, when they meet deceased relatives, they are beaming, or they might also notice that the deceased relatives wear clothes they wore at the time they were alive. So even there isn't much of a consistency, but there are also aspects that are reoccurring, and they also seem to be intercultural and don't vary much in time. So they really show a certain consistency.
Doesn't this individuality of descriptions that happens when somebody is close to death, which is quite a curious collection, indicate that people are right who degrade near-death experiences as dreams or illusions? als Illusion abqualifizieren?
Yes, it's certainly possible to do that. It can certainly be questioned. There is this interpretation that there is this existence of a supernatural world that can be bizarre at the same time. And still, we should view the general concept because there are many aspects that are taken from this sometimes bizarre, but also supernatural world, which are very impressive to us because they completely match with the real world, the world we know here. However, to people who had near-death experience, this world is real anyway. So, the aspect we oftentimes discuss is this supernatural world. Is it real or not? Most people who had a near-death experience don't even discuss this, because to them, the experience was so hyper-real that they don't doubt it, even then, when the person took a taxi to the hereafter. To them, it's a real experience, an absolute reality. It's like to compare that to, it's assumed that there was an expedition around Africa about 2,500 years ago, during the time of Pharaoh Necho, and he wanted to know whether it is possible to go around Africa. And Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, referred to this expedition that must have happened long before his time. He took note of it and said, this can't be real, because when they came back after 3 years, they claimed that the sun was shining in the north at the lowest point of Africa, and that was really unbelievable. But today, this suggests that this expedition must have happened, because it was very unlikely that a sailor or a captain would have claimed something like that, because they knew that they would make themselves incredible. And still, they were so convinced because they'd seen it, and that's why they talked about it. And later on, when we had the knowledge that this had to be the case, that this is the proof, and this is something we can compare to the encounter of deceased relatives, most people report about encounters with deceased relatives in a delirium, and that's the big difference. Deceased relatives hardly ever appear. In the case of near-death experiences, people mostly meet deceased relatives, but there are actually also near-death experiences where they also meet people in the hereafter that are still alive. Now, we can question this and say that's bizarre and very unlikely too, and still, I know of one near-death experience where the person who lived through it met a person that was close to him who was still alive. And then he went back into his body and received a phone call from the person he had just met in the near-death experience, who said, "You know what I just experienced? I had a dream where I encountered you and it was so real." And this is like handling us something like a key, because there are near-death experiences where bizarre aspects occur that can't be explained at first, which questions everything. And then something like a key appears that makes you understand things again and points towards something, and then it's authentic because it's out of the ordinary and might serve as an explanation under certain circumstances.
So, what could be the key? That what we experience as an inner world or soul world now, we will experience as the world of the hereafter later?
Do you mean why there are individual differences?
Yes, exactly.
What the key to this could be? It's being postulated, and I think it's quite obvious that our power of thought and the richness of our souls reflects itself a lot in the world of the hereafter and is sort of constructive. Well, busy at establishing. PMH Atwater is a researcher of near-death experiences who had 3 near-death experiences. She describes that during one of her near-death experiences, she was able to constructively do something with the help of her thoughts, and she even tried to do something. So she tried to imagine a house, and then it was there all of a sudden. It was so real that she was able to open the door and enter it. And then she even became high-spirited and imagined a crowd of people, and then they just appeared in front of her, and to her, They were people that were alive. This may seem a bit eerie, and you might pose the question, is this again just proof that all those things are just mental? That everything is just a pipe dream? Or is there actually something like an active power of thought? This is actually quite comprehensible. And then there is something like a level where these thoughts come into shape, and then a taxi, a cow, or a cable car. These are aspects that we know from our lives. They're suddenly not that alien anymore. Or it could also be a machine or a factory. Then we could really project this level.
So this would definitely mean that every person is able to contribute to his or her individual hereafter.
In a way, yes. And then there might also come up the question, are we then isolated from the world? This again would be something miserable, but the point that speaks against this is this exchange, this encounter with other deceased people, and returning with information that turns out to be true. Well, there is definitely an interaction, and it's like that. Even if we walk through the same garden, every one of us would perceive it differently, right? So, perception depends a lot on somebody's inner life. Even here on Earth, that's something that is something to our own perception and coloring. But it might be even more amplified while being on that other level.
This is a very interesting topic. Dr. Eberhard, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.